Hey guys, welcome back to another Sisyphus 55 podcast. I'm here with Housecat.
Hello.
And today we are going to discuss the good life generally and also in the context of a paper that I had recently published in November that was the end product of about 2-3 years of psychological research in this lab as an undergraduate. And I was quite proud of that. And I guess we should probably just begin with what the paper was about specifically.
Yeah. But first, a word from our sponsor.
This video is sponsored by Babbel. Due to several amazing experiences in Latin America, from Chile to Argentina to Ecuador and Mexico, I've come to really love the Spanish language. Learning it has also opened up an entire world of people, places, art, and overall experiences that I couldn't even imagine knowing about before. Unfortunately, I live in a place where I rarely hear Spanish, and it's rare that I'll ever truly speak Spanish in day-to-day conversation. Sin embargo, recientemente he estado utilizando Babbel, an app that offers a diverse set of methods including podcasts, games, and lessons. Babbel has amazing lessons that allow me to continually improve my spelling and grammar. The lessons are planned based on your own pace, and you're also provided with constant refreshers and reviews so you stay on track. For an additional price, you can also sign up for live virtual classes that are taught by certified teachers and help with maximizing speaking practice. Click on the link below and get up to 65% off Babbel. That's less than $5 a month to learn a language. So this was a very old data set, and I was approached by my psychology professor to look at basically just a collection of personal statements that people had made that were answers to this question that was asked, what is your idea of the good life? And they didn't really know what to do with this data, but it was attached to a larger study that looked at personal goals, so goal progress, what these goals were. It looked at autonomous motivation, which is this the extent to which you are assigning these goals as being volitional or self-concordant or as being in line with your values. And it also measured subjective well-being, depression, and so on and so forth. And eventually we came to this idea that maybe we should just look at another measure that was included in the study, which was we asked them basically, to what extent do you think your current life is in line with this statement of the good life that you had written at the very start of the study, and then through 2-3 time waves they kept being reminded of it. So in like the start of the school year in September, they were asked to write down the good life, and they were asked to rate the extent to which their life was similar to it. And then 3 months later, they did the same rating. Then 3 months later, they did the same rating. And throughout this, they also had their goal progress checked, their happiness checked, all of that stuff. It's a longitudinal study. And
was there any way to like validate their goals or like what they were doing?
So this is one of the maybe pitfalls or issues that comes up in self-reported data and self-assessments. And most psychological research you look at in personality domains is largely reliant on self-assessment. And whenever you read papers, and this was included, is that there will be like a section called limitations. And it's just basically that, we can't prove that if somebody wrote down, I want to be a better friend at the start of the year. Very difficult to measure, especially this is like a data set of like hundreds of people, measure if they're actually achieving any sort of progress on that. And also we don't know their benchmark of progress. Right. So at the end of the day, it's easier for us to just rely on them to hopefully be like somewhat maybe not accurate, but at least honest in their assessment. So they're giving us their rating of goal progress. And there's a whole line of research that looks at something called self-enhancement, which is this kind of seemingly fundamental trait that most people have to always make themselves look better. And I'm sure that this is contributes to some of the goal progress that's reported. But yeah, we can get into that when we talk about research and stuff.
Yeah, that I got another question, but you were still explaining it, so go ahead.
Okay. But going back to the paper, so we basically we called this measure, this rating, good life coherence. So the extent to which your good life and your real life are coherent with each other. And once again, they are rating this. So we generally use the term perceived good life coherence because we also can't, as you pointed out, we can't actually, objectively rate the extent to which these people are living their good life. We don't really know exactly what that means to them. It's more of how they feel. And we found that they were the greater your perceived good life coherence, the happier you were, the more goal progress you had, and the more autonomous motivation you experienced. And there was quite a few other results that we found throughout the study that were just scrapped because of the complexity. And actually, to add on to this whole notion of like validity, we did a follow-up study that's being worked on now during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we basically replicated the same thing. And instead of subjective well-being or happiness, we looked at depression. So we looked at the extent to which good life coherence is associated with depression. And this time we didn't just have them measure their depressive symptoms. We also asked family or friends to give their ratings of how depressed these people appeared. Oh. And we found the exact same sort of results, but flipped. So good life coherence was related to lower rates of depression. So that's, I guess that's one way you can make reports more valid is witnesses. You have, and they're usually called informants or.
That makes them sound more like snitches.
Yeah. Well, and also like I think when you have somebody that's secretly working for the psychology lab and they're presented in a study and they're interacting with participants, but the participants don't know that they're part of the lab, they're usually called. Yeah. Well, they're called Confederates.
An agent of the national health.
Yeah. No, but it's one way to make it a little bit more valid, but I mean, with research, there's always a ton of limitations. But that's just the general. That's without getting into the theory of it or anything. That's kind of the dry overview of what the paper was about. But I think once we start discussing kind of what this means, because it does sound a little bit, I guess, basic.
So just like I guess for me to rationalize it, it's kind of figuring out. If someone feels like this goal resonates strongly with them and they go for it, maybe I'm wording that wrong.
Goal? Do you mean like a life goal or like a personal goal? Like, are you talking about goals in good life, or are you talking about goals in?
Yeah, in the good life.
In the good life, okay.
Yeah. So like, if they feel that what they're striving to do is true to them, that should make them feel like they're living their good life.
Yes. Yeah. And without, this is something we kind of struggled with in writing the paper because you can't make certain claims. And we're in a field that's a little bit philosophical, but you still can't make these like strong assertions like they are living their good life or they are being true to themselves. But there is something to be said about the fact that, and this is kind of what my takeaway was loosely without really necessarily saying it, even though I'm about to say it, is despite a sort of view of psychology that sees people as being largely unaware of their true motivations or desires, it actually looks like, at least in this instance, in this study, there's like people do generally seem to know what they want and perhaps know these sort of deeper volitional goals and values, and they appear to recognize when they're following them, and this seems to be associated with, not necessarily result in, but be associated with greater happiness, greater goal progress, and greater volition.
Right.
I mean that kind of if you want to talk about self-concordance theory.
Yeah, if you want to get into that.
Yeah, so because that's one of the theoretical kind of backbones to this study. And to back up a little bit, so I work in a lab that is a human motivation lab, and its specific theoretical framework is self-determination theory, which posits that there are three basic psychological needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And competence is sense of mastery. Relatedness is a need for belonging, and autonomy is the idea that you're living, or you're living in agreement with your behavior, and you have some sense of ownership in your decisions, and you're living your life. You're not being controlled, basically. And the focus of this study is mostly on autonomy. And there's a kind of subsection of self-determination theory called self-concordance theory, which was developed by Ken Sheldon. And he uses self-concordance and autonomy kind of interchangeably. But to be self-concordant is to be autonomous. It's to be concordant with one's self or true self. And he even has a paper that I ended up citing quite a bit called Becoming Oneself. And I think it was in like 2014 or something.
I saw his name a lot in the paper.
Yeah. He's like and he has a more philosophical bent. And it was very useful to kind of read his work when writing this paper. And self-concordance theory is basically this idea that when you ask a person to write down 3 personal goals, let's say, and then so let's say like they write down, I want like a 4.0 GPA, I want to improve my poetry, and I want to learn how to ski. And then you ask them, to what extent are these, is this goal like truly something you want to do? To what extent is this something that you feel is that you have to do, or you're being forced to do? And people could pretty honestly, even though they've generated these goals completely in their own volition freely, they'll rate some of them as being kind of controlling. Like, oh, like my parents kind of want me to have a 4.0 GPA. They're still pursuing them, and they still are trying to like attain them and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's controlling. And then the the perfection of poetry, for example, that's more autonomous. That would be answering affirmatively to the question, to what extent is this goal reflective of your true self, or is something that you enjoy doing for its own sake? And so self-concordance is that, and people that are self-concordant, he found, tend to, in similar fashion, have greater autonomous motivation, greater goal progress, goal attainment, happiness, so on and so forth. And one of the things that's kind of considered in this paper is that the goals are likely, when people are living in accordance with their idea of their good life, these goals are probably concordant with the good life.
Yeah. Well, I'll just ask this, just because I imagine there's a bunch of different answers to it, but what do you think it is that makes people confused with their goals and, let's say, their parents' goals or somebody else's? Like, where do you think that confusion starts? Like,
Yeah.
where someone will ask, what is your goal? And they'll write down that 4.0, knowing that still, that's not really my goal, but it comes to mind, so.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple ways to approach this question. Sheldon writes about one of the kind of potential enhancers or fundamental traits of people that are more self-concordant is something called trait mindfulness, which is almost like the idea that in the same way people can have differences in openness and conscientiousness, like the big 5 personality, they can also differ in their mindfulness. And mindfulness is kind of related to, self-awareness, that they're actually like, they're aware in the present moment of like their needs, and just generally more concentrated and have a greater sort of sense of self. So I guess it's this blend of self-awareness and mindfulness. And I think we know that you can enhance that for sure, and that also some people just happen to be born with more of a sense of mindfulness and self-awareness than others. And then I also think, and this is a bit more complicated because this is like getting into like Kahneman's like dual process theory and a little bit of something called cybernetic personality coherence. And I'm starting to sound like just a series of random words. But cybernetic personality coherence theory is basically personality coherence just in general is just this idea that like our personalities are these kind of subunits, and in sort of a Jungian way they can it's more psychologically beneficial the more kind of holistic one's personality is, so the more integrated it is. So this is kind of investigated when we look at goals. So goals kind of are the manifestations of values and desires and targets of our personality. And we can kind of imagine like a hierarchy of goals. And the higher up you go, the more abstract the goals are, the less concrete they are. And strangely enough, also, the more close they are to one's sense of self, their true self. The lower down you go, the more concrete they get, less personal.
Yeah.
So a very low level concrete goal could be grabbing a glass of water. That's like almost non-conscious. It's like
guaranteed success.
Yes, and very high success rate. And it's very impersonal. It basically has to do with just, basic biological needs and stuff like that. And it's very concrete. And then you go up a little bit and it's studying for this exam. And that's like, it's a little bit more personal, a little bit more of a complex task, still pretty concrete. There's no real values attached to it. And then it's get into medical school. That goal is kind of like could be considered like a life goal. It could be considered maybe a mid-level goal. And it's a little bit more personal. It's starting to unveil some sort of personality there, maybe some sort of value orientation. Definitely more complex than like picking up water. And then we start to get into like the very high level goals.
Transcendence.
Yes. No, and they start to get more abstract.
Right.
So, because you can start it off like, well, why are you drinking the water? You can survive and stay hydrated. Why do you need to stay hydrated? Because you need to focus in order to study for this exam. Why do you need to study for this exam to get into medical school? They're all attached to each other. And then we start getting into, well, why are you trying to get into medical school? To become a doctor. Why are you trying to become a doctor? Maybe you have some sort of, care for other people. Maybe you have some sort of power-hungry desire to, just attain that image of being a doctor. Who knows? And maybe your level of abstract isn't quite as high as other people's, and maybe it differs. But between the goals in these hierarchies is this sort of idea that they're not always easily attached. Like, as I mentioned, this sort of ladder of they're all sequentially aligned with each other. Sometimes people just happen to have a better ability to cohere all of these,
or like rationalize it all together.
Yeah. And they found actually Bauer, who was the main editor of this paper, he
shout out.
Yeah, in the first revision, he kindly pointed us to one of his own papers, and I think it was Bauer and McAdams, like 2004. But it had very much to do with this idea of personality coherence, and they found that coherence between goal levels, so goals that were related to one another, actually resulted in greater progress and greater well-being and so forth. So how we conceived of the good life in this paper is we looked at Aristotle's definition of the good life, which is basically it's the ultimate goal. It's almost a meta goal, and all other goals are sort of neatly, in an ideal sense, they're supposed to sort of like supplement it or add to it.
Right.
And using this kind of idea of like abstract, we're trying to think of the good life is basically this ultimate meta super goal that I don't know if goals underneath it are cohering to it, it's already very abstract, then you're possibly seeing greater benefits. And, maybe it's needlessly complicated as a theory. And
So,
yeah.
just what you were saying, just how it sounds to me is that, correct me please if this is wrong, but like it sounds like some people, when you're talking about those lists of goals that kind of relate to each other, it's like they'll see the goals as individual steps, whereas it seems like other people are able to see it bigger picture and they can actually gain momentum with each goal, whereas the former, they kind of have to stop and restart at each one.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you don't have to stop or restart, but
But just less like fluidity.
yeah, well, you would have to stop and restart at each goal if there was a lack of integration between goals.
Right.
It's you would kind of struggle. You'd go, well, I'm doing this, and then maybe you'd reach like what they sometimes call an action crisis, where you actually don't know what you're doing, and it can completely throw you off. But it's actually very beneficial because it makes you reevaluate what your values are and what your kind of life plan is. And this isn't also to suggest that people have this sort of underlying concrete life plan that's just floating out there. Like it's also
No, yeah.
not that I can like claim this empirically, but I would assume it's very sort of free floating and integrative, and it's constantly being reworked and mended. But at the same time, there is some sort of fixed essence to
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's like I always forget if this is a word or not, but it's like a very egoic study, I guess, and that there's a lot of it's relying a lot on how people feel about themselves, and it's that sort of, you're relying on like intuition pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing is I think when just you are talking to a friend or a family member and they're maybe having to figure out some sort of tough life decision, the common piece of advice given to them is to trust their gut and to like think with their heart or something like that. Like this sort of appeal to the self that isn't rational
Yeah.
almost. And yeah, I mean it's who knows how true that is beyond just like anecdotal
Yeah.
evidence, but I mean it seems intuitive that's how it would work.
Yeah. I find it really interesting just because, like, I know you said you can't make certain like claims, but it's interesting seeing that, at least to me, some people, it's like they have a little more insight into what's happening, like internally, or they're a little less externally fixed.
Mm-hmm.
Like they can take it in, but also reassess inside. It's not all just because yeah, something you were talking about earlier in terms of like the confusion between someone else's goal and their own just made me think a bit about like being gullible.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's usually when you're only taking things externally and it's just you don't really know what's going on, so you trust the first thing.
Yeah, well this it reminds me of dual processing theory by Kahneman, which I remember I was originally going to bring up in one of the first drafts of the paper, but we realized it was like very, very complicated and just like needlessly complicated. It's like a cognitive theory, and we're like personality, but he kind of proposes this idea that isn't entirely new, but I think it helps with this discussion, that we almost have two selves. We have this kind of momentary self, the one that is, perceiving things, and like me right now, I'm talking, I'm moving my hands around. I'm not really like actively being aware of this, but I'm in this moment. I'm right here, and then there's this other me that is reflective, and it's the one that's thinking about the past and the future, and it's trying to integrate these things, and it's trying to form some sort of coherent narrative.
Yeah.
And he was very interested in the miscommunication between these two selves, that they very rarely agree on things, and that this is probably what causes a lot of people to end up going down the wrong way in general, and just why do we tend to lead a lot? Why is it so difficult to lead a life that we would want to live?
Yeah. Well, and I just finished the book by Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, and just at the end they talk a little about depression and anxiety, and I really like the way one person put it, because it has to do with what you're saying in reference to the our sort of biographical nature, like our past and present and future selves, and he was kind of illustrating depression as being you're fixed on the past, and then anxiety as you're fixed on what could go wrong in the future. And I think that is where a lot of that communication failure happens, is when you're not in the present anymore, you're stuck in those two.
Yeah, no, that's like a very good way to think about the this kind of past and future self. And yeah, I don't know, it's this theme of like integration that I think is I think it's very like holistic. It's very much across cultures. I'd almost make that claim, is this sort of idea of totality and self-awareness and integrating different aspects of the self, and also this embrace of like multiple selves.
Well, speaking about like the whole self, like I think someone who's really important to the article that I'd like to hear more about from you is Carl Rogers, who had a lot to do with the he sort of created him and Jung and a few other people sort of created the idea of the self that we know today, and that we're running a lot of research off of. So how did Carl Rogers and people like him help influence the study?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I guess in like a psychological sense, they definitely were sort of the, probably them and William James, like the forefathers of this sort of like ego. I mean, although now I think about it, like there is like actual ego psychology.
Yeah.
You look at like Anna Freud, and but just this idea of like a coherent unitary self.
Yeah.
And I think that's when I first approached the project. I think that was my idea of the self. Also, was this kind of singular unit that people are almost trying to, in order to live a good life,
get into.
Yeah, they're almost trying to like penetrate. But the opening quote of the article by Carl Rogers suggests a little bit more of a nuanced view. He says the good life is a process, not a state of being. It is a direction, not a destination. And I think he's suggesting more of a free-floating sort of ego that's very open and receptive to alterations and change. And there are perhaps sort of value indicators within it that are pointing it to certain goals and desires, but then sometimes along the way they might be informed and in turn be altered in their own sense by other value indicators. And there's probably like a very complex system or model that could be developed to explain something like this, if that was ever possible. And you almost wouldn't want it to be possible, because I also think one aspect about the human life that's so beautiful is the fact that it's such a mystery of how we ever really have these moments of knowing our true selves, or living a good life, or even knowing what we want.
It just reminds me of Man and His Symbols by Jung. I forget which culture it's from, but they bring up this idea that in this one culture they have this idea of the self being this sort of shaman or spirit-like thing, and we've all had insights and we've all had gut feelings, and Jung kind of said that was like the spirit in all of us directing us in this certain way. So is that kind of what you mean by like they're getting pointed?
Yeah, and Jung was a symbolist, so he very much like believed in obviously like the archetypes, and that there was some sort of underlying like structure, and he would have very much proposed this idea of almost like almost like a skeletal like underbelly of mythology that's informing our lives if we could only tap into it.
Well, yeah,
And
he kind of thought that we made or were discovering all that stuff because it was a reflection of what we thought was going on inside. So it's like this constant back and forth.
yeah, and I actually think, I don't know, because Rogers is, I would say, different in that Rogers doesn't necessarily ascribe any sort of universalist like theory to this as much as Jung does.
Yeah.
He's more about what does, and he's definitely one of the greatest figures in client-centered therapy for a reason, is what does the person want
Yeah.
in that moment? What do they want? What do they need? And not in like a base sort of like animalistic sense, but what do they truly like value in that moment?
Well,
And
yeah. Well, he was really special because he essentially went, this person isn't doesn't need to be fixed into this. They just need to realize what they are and get comfortable with that. Like they don't need to change. Like, I found that really special.
yeah, no, he and the reason why I used him in this article is because I think he's like a very good transition to why autonomous motivation and this whole idea of autonomy is such an interesting measure to use, because it's such a I don't know, the closest indicator we have to some sort of intuitive sense of you're actually living your own life, you're doing what you want to do,
Right.
that goes beyond just like happiness or something. You can ask someone if they're happy, and they could be like boozed out of their mind in a bar or something like that, and and they'll say, yeah, I'm happy, but like reflectively, if you ask them, are they happy, that's a little bit different. And I think like asking someone if they're living in accordance to what they think their life should be, it hits something a little bit deeper and a little bit more meaningful than beyond just, are you living like pleasurably.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I remember it was something I was thinking about a few years ago, was this idea of like toxic positivity, and that when you say happiness or are you happy, a lot of people think of this sort of like cartoon like idea of joy and pleasure, but like everything, like every emotion, like everyone has their own way of feeling that. And I think it's what made Rogers so special, is that it made people realize, I don't need to feel that type of happy. I just like, how do I get my own version, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and I that's a nice way to think of it, is to have your own happiness, not just to be happy.
Yeah.
And one of the things we were looking at originally when we were looking at the good life is, are there distinct differences between the happy life and the meaningful life? And if you break this up into more kind of ancient philosophy, there's this debate of eudaimonia versus hedonia. And, hedonic pleasure, the hedonic life is one of, you're living kind of more Epicurean and just enjoying the senses and not really reflecting as much. It's a little bit more animalistic, and not in like a necessarily like derogatory sense. And then the eudaimonic life, Aristotle strictly defined as you're like living by these specific virtues.
Yeah.
But more broadly, it's like you're living meaningfully. And I think Roy Baumeister, he actually found an art, he wrote, he did a study where he actually classified people based off of whether they were living happy lives or meaningful lives. And he found that, there is like actual differences, and happy people tend to, or like the people living a happy life, they tend to not have as many goals or anything. They tend to be a little bit more susceptible to major life changes, and people in meaningful life, they had a sense of duty and pride in their life, but they weren't necessarily like always happy.
Yeah.
And his argument was that this is like important in a sense, because you can claim that someone who's spent their whole life floozing around and going to bars and flirting and, never really developing any serious relationships because they didn't really matter to them.
Living large.
Yeah.
And largely living.
But at the very end of the day, they haven't really contributed anything. They haven't really done anything. Still, at the end of the day on their deathbed, you ask them, have they lived a happy life? They hypothetically would say yes, and that's completely fine. And also, a person that, is brought into a concentration camp has to endure great horrors and sacrifices. And, at the end of the day, you can ask them, have they lived a meaningful life? And yeah, they still have lived a meaningful life. So it doesn't partial off or take off the possibility for people across varying circumstances to still live a life of some worth substance. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, it definitely made me want to, in future studies, it would be cool to look at, what are the differences, because just the good life broadly is probably some mix between happiness and meaning.
But, that goes back into that sort of, that idea of feeling like the way that they rationalize their story and who they are, if they can feel like what they've done is meaningful or that it makes them happy. Like, it really goes down to trust in yourself and knowing about yourself.
And I was also thinking that in itself is probably an individual difference in how people consider a life well lived. Is are you living a life that on your deathbed you would want to say was a life well lived, or do you want to live a life that in the moment you were saying this is a life well lived? And one would probably be more happiness based and one of them more meaning based. Yeah.
I guess following that, and I guess to end it off, are there any other like psychologists or philosophies or ideologies or anything that contributed to the paper? Just any ones you want to give credit to?
Oh my god. Yeah, I mean, it is a lot of citations.
I mean, don't pull up the bibliography.
Yeah, let's start at the first citation.
Just say some links.
I think that the one goal that kind of stood out to me that I found quite interesting, or I guess there were two studies that stood out to me, or two kind of thoughts that helped with this paper. And one of them kind of informed my own kind of idea of the good life. There was a study by Deci and Huta where they looked at they had people either generate personal goals that were specifically in the interest of increasing their happiness. So they are making these goals so they will be happier. So it's, something like, I'm going to watch more movies with my wife, or I'm going to walk my dog more, or I'm going to go hang out with my friends once a week. Like, these are specifically for happiness related reasons. Then they had people generate meaningful goals that meant a lot to them, that were volitional to them, so self-concordant.
Right.
And they found that the meaningful goals, not only did they lead to greater progress, they were more likely to be attained, they also resulted in greater happiness as a result.
No longer duration.
Yeah. Whereas the goals that were generated specifically for happiness did not show the same sort of hedonic benefit. And it kind of made me think of like that idea of like, having sand in your hand that, if you try to grab it too strongly, it all spills out. It's happiness is not something that you can kind of pursue in a sense. It's something that happens while you're living your life.
Well, it just reminds me of like making music, because like having a good boys' night or something, or it feels really good in the moment. But I always get this thing like the next morning, or sometimes like a day after, like you just feel like a little bit, you were up so high and then you're, just back to normal. So you feel a little weird. But I always know with like albums especially, where it can be quite frustrating during it, you can have problems, but the amount of time after where you feel just like on top is way longer, just because you put this meaningful work into something.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like a
And I guess like it's there to last too. Like that night is a night, but this you've created something.
yeah. There's definitely something more enduring about meaningful projects, and yeah, no, I don't know. That study kind of spoke to me. And then the other is Laura King. She did these studies on. She came up with this concept of possible selves, and this really informed the methodology of the paper. She and specifically she came up with this idea of best possible selves, and basically it was just asking people, like for example, she asked divorced women, what would have the possible self been that remained married to this partner?
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, and then what was your best possible self? What was your worst possible self? And people would actually write it out. And she was kind of interested in, and she wrote this in her future directions in one paper, is in examining not just possible selves in this sort of a little bit more restricted sense, but just life philosophies in general and how they contribute to ideas of greater psychological well-being and so forth. And so this paper is a bit of an answer to that call, in that we're expanding beyond maybe just the self and we're looking at the good life, which is more of like a philosophy. But all these concepts are so closely related, like that. And I think this idea of good life coherence touches on so many of them. You can talk about them forever. But I liked, Laura King's work, and Huda and Desi's were very good.
Right on. Do you have your own personal interpretation of the good life?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too hokey and just try to make like an abstract idea of it. And I do think that they're all very personal.
I mean, the universe is love.
Oh, you already knew what I was going to say. I think right now, I think mine probably changes quite a lot, because I think you're always also projecting yourself like 10, 15 years into the future. It's never like too long. You're not thinking about your like 75-year-old, like where you want to be in, like when you're 75. You're kind of thinking in this sort of like, you're a little bit healthy, you're kind of, you're a little bit older, a little bit more mature, you have a few more financial resources, like stuff like that. Just in general, like your material goods are a little bit better.
You're seeing yourself as your dad.
Yeah, yeah. but they're, like, these are things that they probably bias the insight a lot.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it's just because of the pandemic, and I've been in a city, and when I come back home and it's like in the forest, it definitely kind of makes me appreciate the slow kind of life in the forest. And there's deer, and there's, I mean, yesterday you and me got threatened by a dude with a shotgun, which is, that's one of the maybe one of the adverse side effects of living out in the country. But it's still like I am starting to think of a life as, compared to previous years. I think I was thinking more materialistically and like fame and everything. And I'm starting to drift a bit more towards a simple life and getting away from people. And I guess you just start to know your values. You're less in an exploratory mode.
Yeah, like what you feel would be comfortable. Yeah, or satisfying.
Yeah. And I'm also always open to it changing.
You're always down to clown.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for translating.
Yeah.
What about you?
Just, yeah, I mean, it's always changing. There's probably, I might like rephrase it differently, but I think to me it just means if you can, the good life is like if you can be friends with yourself and trust yourself, and like really trust yourself, like, like everything we've been talking about, like if you just can trust those feelings, and you can look at those insights into the future and stuff, and you can really sit there with it, and you can enjoy time alone, and like you said, like taking those slower parts, because those aren't always comfortable. Sometimes you're hit with some stuff you haven't thought about, or because you've been busy, but just really getting into that and just getting used to like the person you are, or that you're in.
The person that you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is very nice. The idea of like being a friend to yourself. Like I've never thought of that. That is, and that actually very much ties in with everything that we were saying. Is that idea of volition and being kind of true to yourself. But I think being a friend to yourself is almost better. Because it's like, you can be kind of hard on yourself if you have this quest to always want to do more and more.
What I mean is like, when you're like with your friends in like a public area or something, you're like kind of with, you're snickering at stuff and like you're teasing each other. If the amount of times I've been like in public and that's going on in my own head where I'm kind of laughing, I'm making myself laugh. It's like, it sounds a little bit nuts, but I think that's so important that you can have fun with yourself and you just like appreciate who you are.
Yeah.
But almost from like a secondary perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really like that. Words of wisdom.
Self-love.
All right. I think that's about everything.
Merch.
Oh, yes. Also, we did just recently drop some new merch. If you guys are interested, link is in the description.
What is this out on, like the 24th?
I think, yeah.
All right, yeah. So then the album should be out by Housecat. It's self-titled. Thanks for the spotlight.
No worries. Which year?
Which year?
Yeah.
2022.
Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, I've been in the woods for too long.
Yeah, it's that slow lifestyle.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening. I have no idea when the next podcast episode will be, but